Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin friends and Formula One fans on race day here in Mexico City. Max Verstappen is simply unstoppable. Career success number 51, which puts him on a par with none other than Alain Prost. It was his 16th victory this season, and the foundation for this he has laid at the start. The two Ferraris from the front row of the grid got off to a really bad start, Verstappen better, but the best start was actually made by Sergio Perez from 5th position. He then took advantage of the slipstream on the long sprint towards turn 1 and was even in the lead for a fraction of a second until things turned out quite differently. Collision with Charles Leclerc. Charles Leclerc, who was able to continue, damaged his front wing a bit. For Sergio Perez it was the end. He was able to limp back to the garage, but then it became clear relatively quickly. A repair made no sense. It's very, very bitter, of course, to drop out in the first corner at the home race, even more so after such a great start. Really bitter. The question of who was to blame wasn't really asked. It was a turn 1 incident, but if you look at who could have avoided the accident, you have to say Sergio Perez. Charles Leclerc in the middle, Max Verstappen to his right. He can't get out of it. Perez, on the other hand, could have simply turned in later and then none of this would have happened. So it's really bitter. He'll be really annoyed. The scenes that took place in the stands, or perhaps we should remove the plural and say the scene, at least one of which is known, were very, very ugly afterwards. F1 has launched its Respect campaign here and so on, and then there's a video that surfaced of a Perez fan beating up Ferrari fans. And now you can say, yes, there were about 150,000 spectators here, and 149,999 behaved well. Only the one didn't. Nevertheless, it's an absolute catastrophe for me that something like this is now happening in Formula One. That should not be, that must not be. I hope that was just a slip here in Mexico, because emotions boiled over. But yes, I'm a bit lost for words. I think it's really sad that something like this has now reached Formula One. In the end, there were boos for Charles Leclerc on the podium. I think you have to slowly get used to the fact that something like that has happened. That's not sporting, of course, but somehow you can't hold that against the Mexicans. The other thing, of course, is not acceptable at all. Kevin Magnussen was definitely responsible for the incident of the race, even though it wasn't his fault. About halfway through the race, his left rear tie rod broke. Now you're asking yourself, rear left, it actually looked like the right rear tie rod. No, it was actually on the left rear, and that's why he turned left. So what exactly happened there? Actually, the brakes overheated, and because the brakes got so hot, the tie rod got damaged, collapsed, and that's why he crashed. It looked pretty severe. He himself was not as shaken up as it first appeared. The car then also started to burn briefly, so the car can probably be written off. Günther Steiner has probably already taken out his calculator. Of course, it was very, very bitter. There was a red phase and the race was restarted. It helped one or the other, but unfortunately less so for his teammate. Nico Hülkenberg got off to a great start, was in 8th position at one point, was already in the pits, and then the red flags came out. Actually, Nico Hülkenberg had planned a 2-stop race and assumed that would actually work quite well. The simulations showed that they would still be in the top 10, but then the red flag came out and he ran out of the medium tires. 7 laps before the end of the race, he couldn't fight back. Before that, it looked like he might actually get a point, but Hülkenberg was pretty served afterwards. He said that the old car, the old specification, might even have been better than the new version that was only launched in Austin. Why? Because one of the strengths of the old car was slow corners, and here it's mainly about slow corners. Team boss Günther Steiner sees things a bit differently, saying that if you look at the race pace, it was actually quite good. They were able to keep up quite well in the first stint. With the old car, the tires would probably have died after 15 laps. That's why Haas is relatively certain that the new specification was better here too. Nevertheless, Nico Hülkenberg at his 200th Grand Prix would have been particularly pleased with points. Combative performance, great race, not rewarded in the end. He was a bit frustrated and said that hopefully this is a wake-up call to the factory in the direction of updates, although this year I think there is not quite so much going on now. Speaking of Haas, perhaps some of you have already had a look at our new print magazine. There we have a very, very detailed report on the Haas pit gantry. It only has 3 seats, and in this article you can find out about the technical features of this pit gantry, why it only needs 3 seats, and why it was made so small in the first place. And in the print edition, as we've already said once or twice, there's also a story about problem children, and, well, Ferrari is one of them. Yesterday's sensational qualifying session, we analysed why it went so well. Then there were the starts. Carlos Sainz told us today, here in Mexico City the starts were not so great all weekend. Actually the starts at Ferrari are quite decent. Here it didn't really work out. Quite bitter to come back from the front row of the grid like that. Both Red Bulls were actually already over, which is bitter. Charles Leclerc also damaged the front left front wing end plate, which then fell off, and there were still discussions. They had to go to the stewards because there was a suspicion that Charles Leclerc was driving an unsafe car. You'll remember that this often happened with Kevin Magnussen last year. Günther Steiner was then always pretty pissed off when the fried egg flag came up, meaning that he had to drive into the pits and put on a new front wing. Now they actually changed something in the rules after all those discussions after Austin last year with Fernando Alonso, and they took that up with the stewards. Nicolas Tombazis, the FIA single-seater chief, was on, and he said they agreed that this is how it's done. A front wing end plate is nothing serious. It doesn't make the car unsafe. Ferrari also said, well, it all happened in a short period of time, the damage on lap 1, and then the front wing end plate fell off on lap 3. At first they didn't see what exactly was broken, then supposedly Ferrari said they wanted to react to it anyway and bring Leclerc in for a pit stop, but then it flew off anyway. I don't really want to believe it, to be honest, but so no penalty, because it turned out that in the meantime they agreed that the front wing end plate was okay. But even without the front wing end plate, Charles Leclerc's first stint looked pretty decent. Yes, he wasn't able to put Max Verstappen under pressure, but he was able to keep up really well. And that's on this track, where following another car is always a big problem with overheating. Ferrari, by the way, was using an asymmetrical cooling setup with the left side much more open than the right, which was the new cooling package that they hadn't run at the start of the weekend. Then they saw that the temperatures weren't quite as high, so they would do the cooling package only on the left side. That looked quite funny and obviously worked well. In the first stint they could stay on. Verstappen then came into the pits. Ferrari left Leclerc outside, so Ferrari on one stop, Red Bull had been on 2 stops, and then came the red flag. Christian Horner, the Red Bull team boss, said it was a bad time for Red Bull, but I'm sure it was a much worse time for Ferrari. Then Ferrari went into the second half of the race on the hard tires, and then nothing worked. That was an absolute disaster pace. You could have actually used the medium tires because Charles Leclerc had switched to the hard shortly beforehand, which means that they at least fulfilled the requirement of running both tire compounds. They could have put on the medium, but they only had one used set left. Nevertheless, Lewis Hamilton, for example, did that and even set the fastest race lap at the end. In hindsight, you're always smarter. The competition thought that Ferrari would do it that way. Ferrari itself didn't even think about putting on the mediums for the second half of the race after the restart, so only positions 3 and 4 for Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. The positive surprise this weekend was definitely Daniel Ricciardo in the AlphaTauri. A sensational 4th place on the grid yesterday and 7th today. He could have done a lot better without the red flag. Lando Norris, for example, was a beneficiary. Still 7th place, a really strong performance from him, and of course an application to Red Bull, which is still keeping things relatively low-key with Sergio Perez. He has a contract for 2024 and so on. But Daniel Ricciardo has definitely shown that he's a force to be reckoned with. Yuki Tsunoda, the teammate, had to start from the back, then also benefited from the red flag, and the pace of the AlphaTauri was just really strong. He could have scored good points too, but was too impatient in the fight with Oscar Piastri, spun and didn't score any points in the end. Still, big points for AlphaTauri, best result this season. 6 points for Daniel Ricciardo, and that's 6 very, very important points. This brings them level with Alfa Sauber, both now on 16 points. AlphaTauri has the lead because of the better individual results, and AlphaTauri has actually made up 2 places in the Constructors' Championship, because before they only had 10 points, Haas is on 12, and now AlphaTauri and Alfa Sauber have 16 points. It's going to be a really, really exciting race at the end of the season between the 3 teams. Haas only has a little hope for the sprint weekend in Brazil, where the track characteristics could be suitable. If the big points don't come there, Haas will probably have to settle for last place in the constructors' standings. As you can see, they're working hard behind the scenes with the triple header, the last race, coming up in Brazil. That means for you, you will soon get content again, and if you want to bridge the time until then, we have made a video about the Formula 1 logistics. It explains how such a triple header works at all, how the freight looks like, and a link to it is in the video description. I hope you can use it to pass the time until the next Grand Prix.